Hi, Kirsten Lovett here from Now Moment Journey, the Now Moment Journey podcast. And I thought I'd just talk to you guys a little bit today about music and how it relates to what I do as a shamanic coach, and some would call it a shamanic practitioner. I am, I do a variety of things, but for today's purposes, I'm called a shamanic coach or shamanic practitioner. I also, read tarot, and um, I'm an animist educator, which means that comes up in various teachings that I do. And I also facilitate a free Facebook group that focuses on Nordic animism and also European animism, Northern European, also European, especially pre-Christian animism. So I thought I'd talk a little bit today about, because as you can see by the Christmas tree back here, this particular podcast episode is being recorded during the Christmas holidays. And so during this time of year, I tend to focus more on music anyway, because I think that music is a big part of the holidays in general for most people, and it really is for me too. So maybe that's why I'm talking about this today. And I thought it might be an interesting kind of segue into sort of some of the things that I experience with shamanism, and maybe perhaps how I help people. Because I find that this podcast has been really wonderful, at least for me to do, because it's really helping me to communicate things that are hard for me to communicate. That's it in a nutshell. And there's a lot of reasons why some of these things are hard to communicate, and some of them have to do with history, and not just my personal history, but history in general. And that is kind of a whole other ball of wax there. But I think sometimes with shamanism, various different areas come into play that are maybe most people don't consider to be shamanistic. And so today I'd like to just talk a little bit about music. If we look at, and I'll tell you about my background a little bit with music, but if we look at I don't know if you've ever seen any kinds of videos on, if you don't have any experience with shamanism or animism or any kind of uh, folklore or things like that, you might not be familiar with this idea. But if you are, you've probably seen plenty of videos or film footage or whatever, that music comes into play quite prominently in pretty much all the traditional cultures worldwide. When I say that, I mean Caucasian as well as, other kinds of traditional cultures, whether they be from Asia or North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Australia, etc. So, music, for example, one of the areas that I study, and actually, I say that I study it because I don't teach Nepali shamanism. I study it, but I use it respectfully, of course, pretty often. I won't say that I do it every day, because I do tend to not be as consistent as I'd like to be. I think you're supposed to do it every day, and those are chants, which I'm sure you've heard of. Perhaps not the kinds that I'm talking about, but you've heard of chanting in general. And so that's a form of music, of course, vibration. And so at least that allows me to practice some kind of music every day. But in the way that it's being practiced, it's much more of an energy kind of, healing, really, because that's the ultimate goal. But I think also it's an energy uh, I don't want to say disruptor, but if you know that you wake up, if you're a sensitive person, highly sensitive person, or a person who's an empath, you're usually kind of aware at some point. It may not happen right away, but usually kind of aware um, when your energy isn't quite feeling great, like you're like something feels weird, or it could be really, really like drastic, like you're like, whoa, something is really like not, you wake up on the wrong side of the bed. I'll be honest with you, I did that today. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed, metaphorically speaking, of course, and I was very happy eventually after some mental kind of like, I really don't want to do this, but I did it anyway. I did my mantras, and they are associated with, I'm not supposed to talk about it, so I can't tell you any. But anyway, I did the mantras, and I did feel better. And I think it's because you'll notice, for those of you watching the video, there's like the sun is like right in my room. So this is like the perfect time to record because the lighting's actually pretty good here. But anyway, the energy, if it's undesirable energy, that's a good thing to have the energy disrupted so that you feel like your body feels better, your mind, your spirit, etc. Your for those of you familiar with the different energetic fields outside of the body, feel much more cleansed and protected and resilient, as opposed to kind of heavy. I think if you're familiar with, I'm also a student of Andean mysticism, and as well as Sather. But in Andean mysticism, one of the things that the Pacos, that's the name for the kind of shaman priest, and the priest is used differently in that culture. But anyway, the medicine man, let's say, or woman, they tend to look at energy as either heavy or light. So I think that really resonates with people who are sensitive to vibration. And you know who you are. You're usually somebody who, maybe you're clairaudient like I am, or you love music and you're very sensitive to it. And I think musicians who become trained, heighten their abilities because they have to do it in their practicing. So it's kind of like it's a conscious thing. But even if you're not a trained musician and you just have a natural ability for that, or if you you sense things, your perception is very heightened. And then some people have sensitivities in different areas. Obviously you've heard of clairvoyance or clairsentience, cognizance, etc. Those kinds of things. So I don't want to get into that right now. But getting back to, I was trying to kind of relate like what the various indigenous cultures that I continue to learn from or have learned from in the past, and by maintaining relationships. And I have to define again what a relationship is in the context of what I'm talking about today. A relationship in the context of what I'm talking about today is not necessarily one with a human person. Let's just call them spirit relationships, because sometimes it's, at least in my life, most of the time, the work that I do is mostly invisible. Spirit. And I think a lot of people who work with deities, or let's say somebody who's involved in Nordic animism or European folklore, or they follow, you've heard of Wiccas, or various different kinds of practices in that tradition. The idea of, let's say, it would be the similar thing as lighting a candle to a saint in a Catholic church. The saint isn't physically there in a human form, but you would be honoring the saint, and light the candle in that person's name. So it's kind of like that in a way. That's kind of a relationship, when a person does that, believe it or not. When somebody goes into a Catholic church, like let's say you go into a cathedral and you light a candle, you're kind of making a relationship with that saint by lighting a candle. And of course, people who do that for their loved ones, they already are in a relationship with their loved ones because they're related, or they, already had a relationship, or have, or continue to have one, etc. So I just wanted to define that, just so to be clear about that. It's not always human to human. Sometimes it's human to, spirit. Sometimes it's human to a specific kind of spirit, like a plant spirit or an animal spirit. So music. So why do I keep bringing this up today? Well, I don't know. It's just been on my mind a lot. And I guess I kind of wanted to let you guys know, podcast listeners who have been really wonderful, and thank you for listening. Maybe you didn't know this about me because I haven't really gone out of my way to talk about a lot of my background. And I'll probably just try and do that in bits and pieces. So as far as my degrees are concerned, I have a bachelor's in music vocal performance, and then I have a master's in music vocal pedagogy performance. Pedagogy is just a fancy name for the art of how to teach something, whatever that the word is before that. So if it was soccer pedagogy, it would be the art of how to teach soccer. So my focus in my graduate degree was with not only performing, which, for those of you, well, most people don't know this unless you've actually been in a music graduate degree. Music is a little different in a scholastic area than other areas. And this is why it relates to shamanism. It's similar to shamanism in this one. There's one or two areas that I wanted to bring up similarities. And that's why I'm making this podcast today. One is, and I'm thinking of actually a friend of mine from my bachelor years, bachelor of music years, my undergraduate years. You know how it is when you go through your semester, you get to the end of the semester and you have exams. Well, you have that like week or 10 days of taking your exams and, getting them all like lined up and everything. And I remember I was talking to this friend of mine, and she and I both had a lot of friends also who were not in music, as well as, friends that were in music. And we would talk to our when I say non-music majors, in other words, our non-music majors, they usually weren't artists. They weren't, visual artists or theater artists or anything. They were like, I don't know, like business degree people or marketing people or whatever. And they were also stressed out because they had to study for their exams too. And they had to get, prepared and all that stuff. And, what everybody has to do that, no matter what degree, of course, that's true. This is in undergraduate. But I remember she and I would both talk about how we would talk to our non-music degree friends about during finals, it's really hard if you're a musician, because in addition to taking your exams and preparing for those, which are usually in written form anyway, like their tests and various, and sometimes it's oral, sometimes you have to do certain kinds of, speeches and whatnot, or performances, of course. But in a very closed situation. It's not like a fun performance at all. It's like, it's basically a test, but you have to practice, and practicing it varies, vocal people tend to practice, I think, in shorter spans of time. Like they'll practice maybe, a half hour to an hour. I don't know a lot of vocalists that practice for like 4 hours straight, because it's really not a good idea. But they tend to practice maybe at least for an hour. But you do that every day. And sometimes you do an hour in the morning, and then you have to come back and maybe do another half hour at night. But in addition to the actual practicing, and a lot of this isn't just random singing, you have to sit down and you have to go through your music and you have to write it out. You have to play it on the piano. You have to figure out what the words are. You have to translate the words. You have to figure out the characterization of the song. I mean, there's a lot of layers to, at least from a vocal aspect. Instrumental, same thing. You got to sit down, work out the technical side of it, then eventually learn the artistry side of it. And then, because I studied piano for many years, so and I had kind of an unofficial minor in college. It wasn't really an official minor, but anyway, I'd studied for many years. And so same thing. If you're playing an instrument or if you're singing or doing whatever as a major in undergraduate, you're doing that on top of all the sit down with your book and study your chemistry final and your accounting final and your English lit final and your whatever other, subjects you have. So it's a lot more energy that you have to put out at the end of the semester. And, it's just something that non-music majors don't understand and they don't take into account. So why am I bringing this up? And I'm going to bring up another point that's a little different, but I bring this up today because, see, you can tell the sun has passed now. So I bring this up because I think this is true for people in shamanic. If you're a shamanic studies person, somebody who has to keep up a practice of energy work in order to maintain, you're like an athlete. Right, let me use another analogy. It's the same thing with, actually, I should have said this. The only other group of people that would understand this that I can think of are athletes, because athletes, if they were majoring, like a physical education major or a sports therapist or something like that, would probably have to keep up some kind of athletic aptitude, in order to teach and whatnot. You know what I mean? So, or especially if they were going to go into coaching eventually, like be a soccer coach or a basketball coach or something like that. And, if we're looking at Olympics, same thing, somebody who's like going to, audition, try out for a team or something, like a really, professional team. They're clearly going to have to do, hours and hours and hours of like, training and, at the gym and with their coach and, etc. So, and that's outside of the classroom while they're studying. So an athlete would definitely be the same situation. Somebody who has to spend time crafting their skill, and it's not with a book. They can't just do it with a book. They have to do the books and the practice. So you catch my drift. So yeah, athletes totally get it. Athletes and musicians are totally in the same boat, and even visual artists and theater people. I think all the artists and whether it's visual or audio, creative, any kind of thing, where you have to practice all the time. Same thing with shamanism. I can give you a tarot reading without doing my shamanic practices that I have to do, and I sometimes find them bothersome, but most of the time I like doing them because I feel better afterwards. It's kind of like exercise, only better. But I bring this up because it's a practice. So if you're looking for a shamanic practitioner, if you're just looking for a tarot reader, and there's some really good tarot readers out there, then that you don't have to worry about whether these people are keeping up some kind of regular shamanic or traditional practice, energy practice. I'm trying to find a kind of generic way of putting this. That's not as necessary for a tarot reading. What it is necessary for is if you're going to need some kind of healing, either one-on-one, or you're going to need some help with areas that are closer to what I do, which is I deal with, I use mediumistic and also shamanic techniques to kind of guide people into how to build these relationships with plant spirits and animal spirits and stone spirits. Shamanic journeying is involved in what I do. So if I'm going to do a shamanic journey with you or anyone else, I have to prepare myself like a couple hours beforehand, if not more. And that's not as relevant to know. I mean, maybe someday I'll tell you about what I do, but that's not exactly the details of what I do aren't as important as, for today at least, as telling you I have to do these things so that I can get my energy body, because there's a thing called the energy body, in a place where it's ready to go, and work with the medicine body, either with a group of people, with one person, on the internet, online, whatever. So, and it's really for the benefit of all involved. It's kind of like the equivalent of, I'd say that it's the equivalent of a surgeon washing his hands or her hands before going into the operating room. Now, it's a dramatic example, okay? But it is kind of, it's a little bit like that, because you're prepping your body to say, okay, we're doing energy work here. It's invisible, which is why most people think it's, or I should say a lot of people think it's, woo woo or whatever, until something happens to them. And then they realize, oh, wait a minute, maybe there's something to this. But it's very important to make sure, I'm kind of saying this because there's a lot of people who are mediums and psychics. And I'd say some of those psychic people, and I consider myself a medium and psychic as well. But when you can bet when I do any kind of reading that involves mediumship, which, by the way, the reading that I sell on my Etsy store does have that. I have to do a shamanic practice after I give the reading. And it's very short. It doesn't take me very long, but I need to do it to disconnect from the person's field, because I actually connect to their field, give the reading, and this is all in, distance. It's not like these people aren't right in front of me, but I need to disconnect, otherwise it just stays right there the whole time. That's not healthy for anybody, So you can see the similarity I'm talking about is practice. And it's usually practice outside of, any other studies that you're doing. And there is a significant amount of book learning going on in, if you're a shamanic practitioner. Depends on the tradition you're studying. I mean, if you grow up kind of learning from your grandfather about the traditions of your ancestors, which is very unusual for people, at least in North America, unless you're a Native American, then you might have a nice memory of that. But most people, even in North America, don't have a background like that. So, and I mean, a lot of the traditional peoples do. But getting back to music, what I'm saying is there is, and I'm saying this to you as somebody who, if you're going to, look for somebody who is a healer or a shamanic practitioner or even a Reiki practitioner, just keep in mind, maybe ask them, what kinds of practices do they do, or background do they have, that keeps their energy body, functioning properly. Because that's kind of like the equivalent of saying, if you were to go up to some professional athlete and you wanted some tips on how to bat better or something, you'd say, what's the kind of bat that you use? And then what kinds of, push-ups do you, what kind of workout exercises do you do so you can build up your arm strength so that you can, swing the bat better. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of my league here. No pun intended. Get it? But you get what I'm saying. What are the things that you have to do to prepare yourself so that you can do your work? That's the bottom line there. So a lot of people, when they think of things like shamanism and being a psychic or doing a tarot reading or, doing energy work, they think, oh, somebody just rolls out of bed and they just do it. It's magic. Well, it is magic, sort of, but there's a lot of preparatory work, and it's very conscious and very studied. So and some of it you have to kind of learn on your own. There's a lot of stuff that we've lost over the last 2,000 years. So that's a whole nother story. So getting back to music, there's a second thing I wanted to talk to you about. The second thing I wanted to mention is, and this comes from my graduate school days, and I'm not going to name my teachers' names, but I'm very thankful to my teachers that I received in graduate school because of my pedagogy training. I had several very good teachers, but I'm thinking of one teacher in particular right now, who's no longer with us. And he was very good about telling people, and this is for voice. Okay. So he was training us to be vocal teachers. And at the time I was very, very much focused on becoming a professor and teaching at the collegiate level, like undergraduate voice or something like that. And so you had to learn things like you had to learn the anatomy and physiology pretty much from, well, you definitely had to learn from here up, but we also had to learn like about the thoracic cage and the, different muscles in your back. And, but you definitely had to learn about the different, anatomy and physiology of the throat and the larynx, etc. But it didn't stop there. That was kind of like more of the nuts and bolts part of it. I think the part that there was also frequency involved, and that he was very interested in voice science, which was definitely ties into, actual vowels having certain frequencies meaning cycles per second. So that's one of the few. I probably diss myself too much in the science background because I have a little bit of a kind of knee-jerk reaction to it. But I do remember this: frequency equals cycles per second. So even he would say, if you sang an E vowel, it would have a certain number attached to that cycles per second. An A vowel would have a different number, et cetera, et cetera. Ah, E, O, U, all different. So the reason I bring that up is, and this isn't the important part, but this is kind of just a sidebar. I thought that was interesting all these years later. And by the way, it's also in my mind because 25 years ago, I actually got my master's. So I guess I've been thinking about it a lot more because of that, because of the timing. But it's interesting when people talk about vibration now, people who aren't in music and they're just interested in like frequency, and you hear that a lot, especially in consciousness studies, or people who are just interested in raising their vibration, so to speak. There's really something to it, as long as it doesn't get used as a vehicle for shaming other people. But there really is something to it, because when you do certain work that does involve music, especially your own voice, and you're singing, and in my case, I'm lucky enough to have studied with these traditional teachers, this one traditional teacher. I'm sorry, I'm changing topics here for a second, but because I've been able to study with this traditional teacher, I'm able to utilize the classical training I've gotten with singing and use it in a way that's, helping me to heal my own energy fields. And a lot of shamanic practitioners and traditional medicine people will tell you that unhappiness, I don't want to call anything worse than it is, unhappiness that occurs to a person, according to the shaman, usually comes from outside in. What I mean by that is it's like in the energy body, and the physical part is usually the last part. I think that's correct. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but that's generally a fairly common perception. And when you consider that, energy fields and vibratory resilience, I guess. It's kind of like something that maybe, I want to learn more about it. So that's one part of it. But here's the real kicker I want to tell you that my teacher told me, my voice teacher. And this had to do with voice. And I think it applies to people teaching either shamanism, animism, shamanic healing, Reiki, anything that's like invisible, and anything that's not just invisible, but is from a spiritual either background, or it could be from an actual tradition. He said a lot of things, but I'll give you one or two things. He said, look, you've got a half hour to an hour with a person. Let's say it's you and another client. Make the most of it. If you're going to use your voice, because a lot of people who teach voice use their actual voices singing to demonstrate, how to, what the kind of tone they're looking for. He would say, don't waste your time just singing for no reason, hoping that the student will get it. Have an idea of what goal you want to reach, with the student. For example, the student walks in, you assess, what the problems are, especially if it's an ongoing student, it's a lot easier because you kind of know what their issues are. But even a first-time student, they come in, they tell you, what's going on or what they've been doing, whatever their background is. You have to listen to them a little bit, and figure out maybe what areas need to be focused on first. And then, by that time, let's say that's like 15 minutes have gone by, right? Or more. And if you have a half an hour with them, well, shoot, it's almost over, right? But if you have an hour with them, then you can say, okay, we're going to try a couple things out here. We're going to look at, what areas you need some help in. The way you choose to do that as a practitioner or shamanic practitioner or a voice teacher, if you let your ego go nuts and crazy on you and take over and say, and just start to reminisce about things that, that are totally unrelated to the student's going to walk out confused and like, what? But if you use your stories, it's fine to use your voice. It's fine to demonstrate with your voice, just like it's fine for me to tell you about my experience, which is, when I talk about myself, yeah, sure, some of it's performance. Okay, I'll be straight with you. But a lot of the times, there's a lot of things that I feel like I want to tell people about on this podcast because I want them to know they can do it. And I want them to know that this stuff is real. And I want them to know that if they're having problems that seem like they're in line with something that I could help with, that maybe by listening to me talk about these things, they feel a little less, scared or distraught or whatever, or they feel like, oh, well, wait a minute, this person's doing this kind of thing. Okay, let me give that a try, or let me listen to some more, what that person's having to say. But if I sit here and, I had to think about today before I came on, what are the things that I would want to hone in on that I was taught? I'd say number one, that was the first thing I could think of that he said. And if I could take one thing and take it to the shamanic community that's online, at least, not the ones that are in villages somewhere that have traditional peoples that are doing a great job. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the people who are, and yes, I'm going to get a little bit like persnickety here, but I'm talking about the people who are online, who seem to want to go on and on and on about telling you what you should do and how you're a terrible person for thinking that you could do something that an indigenous person could do, blah, 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 blah. Well, here's the thing. I mean, we're at a point now where, and this is part of my goal too. So I would say if I was treating this podcast episode today as if you are my voice student, I would say one of my goals today is to make sure that you know that one of these things, and that is, it's fairly clear that you can look at the science and say we're definitely at a point in climate science where we cannot continue to live the way we've been living for the last, some people say it was 500 years. I think some of this stuff was put into place even going back 2,000 years, but the real crux of it got going, I'd say, 500 years ago, I suppose. But there was certainly other times where we were heading this direction before that. So, but of course, the last 200 years have been particularly, and even more so the last 100 and I guess 20 or 130 years are when we've really, because that's when recorded science has been keeping track of things like global climate, etc. If the population of this earth is 100%, and we know traditional indigenous peoples are only 5%, and the reason I can say this with confidence is because I've Googled it and I've looked it up under various, expert sources. Somewhere between 5 and, I'll be generous, 9%. Okay, so if 9% of the entire globe's population is indigenous, and of that indigenous population, we'll be generous and say that 80% of them are practicing reciprocity and traditional ways of like working with the earth, which is essentially what myself and my sister do at Shamanic Earth Medicine. And why did we learn? How did we learn how to do that? Well, some of we kind of, I don't want to deny the fact that we also have ancestry that I think led us to this place. Okay, but we also had to go and do a lot of work with traditional indigenous cultures. Andean, Karo, Nepali, and in her case, she's also worked with a couple other cultures as well. So I'm not saying I did it all, without any help whatsoever from anybody. Okay, no, of course not. I did it. I got a lot of help from actual humans who were and are connected to their traditional ways. Okay, so, and yet I'm not a traditional indigenous person. You know what I mean? So, but I've been initiated, so I'm allowed to do these things, in certain things, not all of it, just certain things. And that's a whole nother story too. But I'm part of the 100%, I should say part of the 95%, or if you're going to be generous about it, the 91%. Okay. And I'm just like you, essentially. I grew up in a suburban kind of, 20th century fast food. Well, I had a pretty good diet at home, but you know what I'm saying. I grew up around a lot of toxic stuff, just like everybody else does. Okay, every day, still do. We grew up in a society that treats everything like commodities. The earth is a commodity, the water is a commodity, everything's a commodity. That's not how a traditional person looks at it. Okay, so if one of my goals is to get people to relate to the earth in an animistic way and to have a love in their heart and to really open their heart up to, let's say, this tree spirit that's right outside my door, or the water that's down, a couple miles, or if they don't have those things, if they're living in a really urban environment, maybe they decide to buy a plant and build a relationship with that plant spirit, because that's the only way they can do that. And they know that they feel better when they do that. Well, if I'm going to sit there and tell them how terrible they are for not, studying with a traditional person, or because they've been living their entire lives in a culture that tells them not to respect the earth, that they're a horrible person for doing that, or any other insulting things. What exactly am I doing? Why am I doing that? There's really no good reason. I mean, I'm not actually helping anybody by telling them that. So the reason I'm saying this is because there's a lot of shamanic practitioners, and I guess I'm being a little bit of a police person right now. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be like that, but I'm a little bothered by something that I was lucky enough to receive in vocal pedagogy, which was guidance and wisdom on how to teach people. Maybe if I don't have all the knowledge to teach all the expert things that Indigenous people do with great facility, and they do. I don't have that kind of background. I'm learning, but what I do know is there's a ton of people out there online. All they're doing all day long is telling you, you know, you don't have to do anything because an Indigenous person will do it. Well, guess what? We don't have enough Indigenous people on the entire globe to solve our climate crisis. We need everyone, all hands on deck. And if that means all hands on deck, that means me with white skin, suburban lady, who's been initiated and trained for, and has been consistently connecting with all of her spirits and doing the offerings and teaching people sacred tobacco and teaching, starting a group with, trying to get people to make offerings to their helping spirits in the Nordic animism tradition, which isn't really, it's, some people say, well, that's not really a intact tradition. Well, we got to work with what we got, right? So, and we try to do that with respect and, do the best we can with it. And I think it's better to try to connect with whatever it is, that you feel comfortable with. From my orientation, I've tried to introduce people to the idea of animal, plant, and stone spirits because I've found that those are commonly found in a lot of traditional cultures. All three in various different ways. But I just wanted to tell you those two things. One, music and shamanism have a lot in common because you want to keep an eye out for the shamans, the practitioners especially, who say, look at their resume or look at what they do. They don't have to have a resume, but, look at whatever they talk about a lot and just see if they, you don't have to pin them down about it, but I mean, just see if they ever mention that they do certain practices, do they make offerings? That's probably number one thing for me. If I was going to study with somebody, I would say, do you make offerings like regularly? And if they didn't know what I was talking about, like if I could use another word like pagos or ofrenda or, whatever their language was. Maybe they'd be like, oh yeah, sure, I know what you're talking about. When we do this, we do this particular ritual or we do a ceremony or whatever it is to keep up the, because it's like anything else, you have to keep up. It's like brushing your teeth. It's like doing your exercises. It's like, maintenance, but I'm making it sound like horrible. It's not like, robotic or anything. It's a way of connecting to the spirits because you need to have some way to connect to the spirits in a way that's meaningful to you, that also and means something to them because they need to work with us too. And if you're interested in ancestral, healing, helping spirits, that's offerings are you're going to have to get really comfortable with offerings, And if somebody's teaching you ancestral healing without mentioning offerings, I would really be wary of that person. Unless they're saying you don't have to do it because I'm doing it on your behalf. That's fine. I'm just saying, there's a lot of people doing this work. Unless you're a tarot reader, tarot readers usually don't have to do any of this stuff. They have to do other preparatory things. Like they might have to clear their energy fields, which, I have to do that too. And that's fine, but they don't always have to do some of the things that shamanic people do, shamanic practitioners or certain kinds of healers. So hopefully I've shown you like similarities in that area between that and music, the practice of music. And most people are aware that, if you're going to be a professional musician, you got to practice. You're not gonna, even the prodigy isn't going to roll out of bed and just, I mean, at some point they're going to have to practice. Okay. Number two, and then I'll wrap it up. Number two is I really want people to make sure they know if they're looking for a shamanic practitioner or a teacher. Listen to that teacher in their posts or in their videos or whatever, and just see if they ever bring up what their goal is. If their goal is to get you to be healed personally, all right, maybe I'll let them off the hook and say, okay, that's different. That's kind of like a heightened version of psychotherapy, only with energy work. And I know there's a lot of people who do that, and that's fine. That's totally cool. But if you're going to get into like, more of a shamanistic, things that are outside of you as well, and you will get healed from doing those things. But let's say you want to work with weather spirits. I sometimes do that. Or you want to have a better relationship with sacred tobacco so that you can heal maybe in another area. Well, at some point, I hope that whatever teacher you decide to go with is aware that we also, at this point in time, need to be making sure that we are going forward in a climate that is going to be functioning for human beings. And if they want to believe that, they're going to have to open themselves up, these teachers that I'm talking about, they're going to have to understand the idea that we have to convince or at least educate people who have grown up in either urban or suburban areas that aren't familiar with these traditional ways of looking at the world. Traditional meaning indigenous peoples or traditional peoples who grow up in that kind of culture. Because one of the main things they have to understand is we have to eventually, sooner than later, teach people that we have to find ways in our own environment to create spirit relationships with earth spirits, land spirits, so that we can be in harmony with them. It's like almost tantamount to our survival, because that's how we used to do things. I'm not saying we have to go back to ancient, like prehistoric era. I'm saying there's some things from the past that worked really well. And a couple of the, well, it's probably more than a couple, but some of those things, if they work, maybe we should be practicing them. And the indigenous people have kept that are still survived. There's a lot of people that got killed off, and they weren't all, they were of a variety of backgrounds all around the table. Maybe there's some, credence to what these surviving indigenous peoples have maintained after all these years. But where the problem is, and this is what reminds me of my pedagogy teacher, I don't see anybody like my pedagogy teacher walking into a room of these shamanic practitioners and saying, what are you people focusing on with your clients and your students? Because all I seem to hear or see is kind of irrelevant points to your goals. What are your goals? I just told you my goal, right? So I'll just pretend to be my pedagogy teacher. If I had these people in front of me that are also, shamanic coaches or energy practitioners, I would say, what is it? What's your goal? If you just want to heal people, okay, that's cool. But at some point, if you want to keep living on this earth, we're going to have to also start accepting and practicing things like offerings and relating to the spirit of a plant or an animal or the land, because we need to be in communion with the earth in order to continue to survive on the earth. Because let's face it, the earth will continue with or without us. That's like pretty obvious. I would like for us humans to continue to be here. Yeah, I'm sure you would too. So today's episode, maybe it's been a little bit sparky, but and maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about the my music background. But I think of the reason I brought it up especially is because leadership is very lacking as far as like a group essence in a lot of fields. I mean, I'm not even talking about politics. I'm talking about there isn't really a whole lot of leadership of groups of people trying to agree on the same things and saying we need to make sure this is a priority, because everybody's kind of doing their own thing. And that's understandable because everybody has a small business, or maybe a slightly bigger business, whatever, and everybody's trying to survive, and that's cool. But at some point, I hope that it's apparent to you what some of my priorities are. Yes, I'm here to talk to you so that you will, listen to what I have to say, and maybe take it into account and try out some of the things that I tell you. But speaking of something that I could tell you to do today, for example, here's something I learned from one of my teachers, and that comes from the Andean perspective. And this is something I think even the just everyday people do in Peru. And I'll show it to you right now, and we'll end after this. So I've got a glass of water here, right? You take my finger and go like this. And what I'm doing is I'm tapping my little finger with a little bit of water onto the ground, saying, Gracias, Pachamama. And if you don't want to say Gracias, Pachamama, and you just want to say thank you, Mother Earth, or thank you, whatever makes you happy. Thank you, Gaia. Thank you. I'm just used to saying Gracias, Pachamama. Pachamama is Mother Space Time. And let's see, Mama Ipa would be like the equivalent to Mother Earth, at least from what I learned. And then Uno Mama would be water, and Waira Mama would be wind, and Nina Mama would be fire, and either Kocha Mama or Mama Kocha would be like the mother of the sea. But I'll show you one more time. So you take your finger, right? Gracias, Pachamama. So that the droplets go on the water. So you're not like pouring the entire thing on the floor. And you won't get the floor wet that way. But it's like you're expressing your thanks for Mother Space Time or Mother Earth. And they're different, but for our purposes today. So that's something you can do, and it's not hard, and it's not something you need to be trained or initiated into. And if everybody did that every day, we'd be a lot further along, So maybe somebody will listen to this and tell a couple of their friends, and you never know what might happen after that. So I hope you enjoyed today. And if you want to get into, I want to suggest two things. One is three things, actually. One is I'm trying to put the link to my quiz, Are You an Animal, Plant, or Stone Spirit Archetype, in the show notes or in the details of this video. Or if you're listening on the podcast, it's in the details. So you can take that quiz there and find out what resonates with you. The other thing I wanted to mention is we're actually finishing up a year at the free Facebook group that I moderate, which is kind of a discussion where we meet once a month. And we've been following along with Rune Rasmussen's Nordic Animist Year, which is his research about different what they call Primstop dates, or for example, Yule Day, which just happened yesterday, which is also Christmas Day, of course. There's certain things you can do to honor the ancestors or honor the deities involved. Odin is a big force this time of year, as well as some other deities, and Freya as well, of course. And they all float in and out. Hulda came up recently. She had Hulda's Eve was recent. And of course, his book is based on a lot of research that he's done. So that's, if you're looking to kind of get into honoring, you don't have to have a Nordic background, because a lot of this stuff, for example, there's a lot of Nordic, or I should say traces of Nordic traditions that kind of morphed a little bit. And once the Vikings kind of ended up in, Scotland and England and Ireland, they kind of morphed in there too. So, I mean, there's a lot of people from the British Isles who, even if it's not Nordic, like, Norwegian or Scandinavian, there's a lot of similarities between, I'm sure somebody from Europe would be like, oh, no, there's not. Well, there kind of is, actually. They're not exactly the same, but there are some similarities. So if you're interested in kind of like piecing together the different traces of, and this is mostly based on, this very much pre-Christian. I mean, there's some research that happens during Christianity, of course, because in fact, I think almost all of it is based on, during the Christian era, of course. But we're looking at some of the pre-Christian, like inspiration, those times, I guess is what I'm getting at. And we're going to get into another book next year. I'm not going to announce the book yet, but it's somebody who focuses on land spirits. So that will help you with your own like domicile where you live right now. You don't have to be living in Europe or North America. You can be living in, anywhere on an island in the middle of the Pacific. And we're going to try to learn about what this author has to teach us about how we can relate to our houses and our, in a reciprocity sort of way, in a house white way, in a land spirit way, because these things are real. I mean, and then the other thing I wanted to tell you about is I like to usually mention that our Patreon is the kind of community, if you want to learn about shamanic journeying, if you want to experience those journeys with a community online, if you want to learn about sacred tobacco, how to respectfully work with it, and even learn how to eventually pray with it. We just had I just had a live stream the other week about how to pray with sacred tobacco. And we also did a prayer for the collective. So it can be quite useful once you learn the basics of, how to view the sacred Gran Maestro plant of sacred grandfather, Abuelo Mapacho spirit. We actually worked with Abuelo Mapacho spirit, and I lit a candle to him as well. So, and he's known in South America a lot, and although a little bit up here in North America too. So anyway, those are just a couple of things. My sister is also a excellent practitioner at our Patreon, and she focuses, on so many things. Some of them shamanic dreaming, shamanic journeying. Those are just two of the big ones. And she's teaching a class, Dreaming in the Nine Worlds, and she'll have some other announcements. So you can join at www.patreon.com/shamanic earth medicine, and you can join as low as $1 and get one video a month, one live stream a month, and sometimes you get two for $1. The $5 a month level is for the Zoom ceremonies, where you're always invited to come to the ceremony, and those are a lot of fun. And the $15 a month level is all of the aforementioned, what we just said, the ceremony, the live streams, and you also get a shamanic divination from either one of us included in that. And then you also, at the current time of this recording, get a really low price for Marissa's class, Dreaming in the Nine Worlds. So if you join at the $15 a month level, that's all you pay for her class. It's like included in that package. So we're always having a good time there and doing all sorts of neat rituals. And so it's a really fun community. So we encourage you to check it out. Look at the webpage, see if you like it. All right, well, I'm wrapping it up now, and you know what I'll do? I'm going to show you my rattle. Maybe next time what I'll do is try and open and close sacred space. But for now, here's my rattle. Speaking of music, now I technically should have opened sacred space. I didn't do that. I did do it earlier today, but not on camera. So what I'm doing now is closing sacred space. And some of you have heard of that. And much like a story or a performance or any kind of interaction, there's always an opening and a closing, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end. And a lot of times the directions are involved. So north, south. Sometimes you might do earth, sky, earth. And then I'll show you something else. Something I like to do before and after I do any kind of like, any kind of ritual activity, even just my mantras or whatever in the morning, or if I'm getting ready to do a ceremony. I don't know if you can see this, there's like different colors here, but I like to kind of blow on them. That's like the 4 directions. So I might say, thank you, spirit of the rattle. Gracias, spirit of the rattle. And let's say if I knew I was going to work with certain deities today, I would probably say thank you to those, to those deities. Like if I was going to work with Abuelo Mapacho, I would say, gracias, Abuelo Mapacho. Gracias, Abuelo Mapacho. Thank you for your blessings. Thank you for your wisdom. And if I was starting out, like if I wasn't doing this already every day, which I'm getting ready to do now, I would leave maybe a little bit of, if you decide to, you don't have to be a smoker to do this. In fact, people who don't smoke are at an advantage because they don't have what shall we say, what the typical idea of tobacco is, that it's a terrible thing, which it is in its form, its commercialized form, it's very toxic. But behind that, what they don't tell you is there's a spirit involved. And so when you're not a smoker, you might be a little more, I don't know, open-minded to that idea. Whereas if you're already a smoker, and maybe I'll talk more about that later, it's kind of hard to do that because you're already kind of like, it's a habit. It's really toxic, So, but we're relating to it as a deity that's very healing, because he is, okay? So let's say you had your loose tobacco, you would take it outside and we would say, gracias, sacred grandfather, abuelo, tobacco spirit. And you would just let it drop on the ground. That's just one thing. That's not a ceremony. You're not stepping on anybody's toes by doing that. You're not going to get in trouble with any specific group of people by doing that. I'm not teaching you a specific ceremony. Okay. We're just talking about basic relationships that are basic, is like, they're actually really important, like fundamental basic relationships. Like you can't pass go and collect $200 unless you know these basic relationships. In my book, people who try to skirt around these relationships, by the way, beware of those people. I'm not talking about like doing exactly what I'm doing. I'm saying people who don't do things like offerings, whatever form they are, people who don't think that they need to clear their energy bodies after they do a healing, people who don't think they need to tell you, make sure you're aware that you might want to do this, that, and the other, like, because they're actually concerned about your well-being instead of just doing what they need to do with you. Be wary of these things. and just try to look at shamanic practitioners as they're kind of working with medicine in a different way. And so they need to, myself included, do frequent practice or maintenance in order to keep their energy bodies, functioning. So I think I got that across pretty well. So I hope it did. And I'll try again if I didn't. But I think next time we'll probably have a guest. But if you haven't noticed already, I tend to talk about a lot of different things. Sometimes I talk about sound. Sometimes I talk about plant spirits like sacred tobacco. Sometimes animal spirits. Sometimes stone spirits. Sometimes water. And sometimes just general animism, which kind of connects into a lot of areas. And yes, every once in a while, there is a little bit of like current day issues because we live in the now. So how do we make all this stuff kind of work together is kind of tricky sometimes, Before I leave you, I'll give you this thought. One of the other priorities I have as a teacher is to make sure people know in their urban or suburban environments that they don't have to go to Machu Picchu to practice, connecting with the spirits of the land or the spirits. And I probably need to back up in an episode and tell you why it's necessary to do that in the first place. But you don't have to go to these places. Sure, it's nice if you have the money to do it and you have the the health and the availability. Sometimes it has nothing to do with money or health. It has to do with just availability, but you don't have to. And I've been practicing this for over 10 years without. Yes, I do need to renew myself in a natural environment, but I also know that I can do things in my own environment that, knock on wood, seem to work okay. So, it's a little tricky sometimes, but it's workable, So, okay, well, I hope to see everyone in a happy, healthy 2024. So I hope to see you soon. And thank you for listening today to the Now Moment Journey podcast.